Hello everyone, my name is Delicacy, and this is Video Delicacies, where we seek to taste the greatest flavors that old games have to offer. I just played Spyro 2: Ripto's Rage, which was developed by Insomniac Games, produced by Universal Interactive Studios, and published by Sony Computer Entertainment America. It was released for the Sony PlayStation in 1999 and had a remastered version released for various platforms in 2018. 4 months ago, I kicked off this series by playing Spyro the Dragon for the first time. Like I explained in that video, the Spyro games were popular when I was young, but by the time that I had a PlayStation, I was entering a phase of my life where I was only interested in playing RPGs. I have since outgrown that, and as an adult, I've gone back and played a number of different PS1 games, but I've only now gotten around to playing Spyro. I really liked the original Spyro the Dragon when I played it, but I had some criticisms too. I went into Ripto's Rage excited to see whether any of those were improved upon in the sequel. As before, I played this game on my PlayStation 3 using an original PlayStation disc. Ripto's Rage started with a cutscene in which Spyro and Sparks were planning a vacation together to celebrate their victory over Nasty Nork in the previous game. Instead of a destination resort, however, they found themselves in a land called Avalar. Here they joined up with a resistance group whose members included Elora the Fawn, Hunter the Cheetah, and someone just called the Professor. Together, their quest was to take to task Avalar's newly risen dictator, Ripto, who had sidekicks named Crush and Gulp. So right away, one of my problems with Spyro 1 had been addressed. This game actually had characters in it. I especially liked Elora and Hunter, which is good because I would be seeing a lot of them throughout the game. When I gained control of Spyro, I was in Glimmer, a tutorial level. The basic gameplay is very similar to that of the first game, so I won't go over it again here. The first thing that I did was go into the menu to toggle on the active camera mode. While there, I noticed a minimap option. It seemed odd that this was off by default. My best guess is that maybe it creates a small amount of lag. The save fairy in this game has a name, Zoe. Saving to the memory card can now be done at any time from the menu, so her role this time around is to act as a checkpoint that you return to should you fail. A little further on, I met another character, Moneybags. He wanted 100 gems to allow me to cross a bridge. I think putting this here was incredibly smart. In Spyro 1, collecting gems was basically a waste of time unless you were going for 100% completion, but the game made no effort to tell the player this, so I spent the early game unsure of whether collecting them did anything at all. Ripto's Rage had numerous points where gems were needed to advance, and it demonstrated this in the first 5 minutes of gameplay, so there was far less uncertainty. At the end of the stage, I was given the Magic Pick Talisman by Twitchy the Gem Cutter. Most stages had a talisman to earn by completing the main objective. Usually that was just getting to the end, but in this case it also required defeating 10 enemies. All 14 talismans in the game were mandatory. In addition, each stage had between 2 and 4 orbs to collect by performing optional side objectives. To complete the game, I only needed to collect 40 out of the total 64 orbs. The first orb that I got was from Bouncer the Gem Cutter, who introduced one of the game's new mechanics. Spyro can pick up rocks and then spit them out as a projectile attack. If you use the triangle button to look around while holding one of these rocks, the game will go into a first-person view to aim. One thing that I'm glad stuck around from the first game is the commitment to naming NPCs. That game only had dragons and balloonists, but this one had a wide variety of characters to talk with, and they all had their own name. My second orb came from Kanga the Gem Cutter, who wanted Spyro to light a series of lamps. To accomplish this, I was given access to the Superfly power-up. Putting flight into normal play areas was a great evolution from the previous game where it was limited to bonus stages. This tutorial area left a really good impression. It did a fantastic job of showing off many of the ways that the game had improved over its predecessor. Since we just used one for the first time, let's talk about how power-ups work. Throughout the worlds of Ripto's Rage are pairs of pyramids. When you first find them, there'll be a number in between. Once you've defeated that many enemies, the number will be replaced with a power-up that you can collect as many times as you'd like until you exit the level. I never saw it as a flaw that combat was mostly avoidable in Spyro 1, but if the developers wanted to change that, this was a fairly elegant way of doing it. There were several different types of power-up pyramids. Superfly, as we just saw, allows Spyro to fly similar to the flight stages from the first game. Power Flame turns Spyro's fire breath into a long-range projectile and allows it to destroy things that it couldn't normally. Combination gives Spyro the benefits of both Superfly and Power Flame. Super Freeze replaces Spyro's fire breath with ice breath that turns enemies into cubes that can be used as platforms. Invincible makes Spyro impervious to damage, allowing him to cross dangerous terrain. All 5 of those power-ups last for a certain duration, but the next 2 are special. Supercharge increases the speed of Spyro's charge and allows it to destroy things that it couldn't normally, but the effect ends as soon as Spyro stops charging, so you can't slow down and have to be careful not to collide with any obstacles. Big Bounce launches Spyro into the air and doesn't have any lasting effects. Something that I really like about this system is how each power-up feels like a natural extension of one of Spyro's abilities. It takes something he can already do and upgrades it, turning gliding into flying or breathing fire into shooting fireballs. It really helps to establish him as a character with a specific set of talents. The first homeworld was called Summer Forest. The hub areas in this game were all pleasant to look at and had surprisingly understated music for Copeland. In general, the music was still not really to my taste, but it was an improvement over Spyro 1's. I jumped in a stream, fully expecting Spyro to take damage, but to my surprise, Spyro had learned to swim in the year since the last game. I'm proud of him. Further on, Hunter taught me about another of Spyro's new abilities, which the game calls a hover. If you press triangle while gliding, Spyro will gain a little bit of height at the cost of all of his forward momentum. This is functionally a ledge grab, but one that you have to perform manually. It felt extremely awkward to me, and it was unfortunately required for a lot of the game's platforming. After making a series of jumps, Hunter gave me an orb. One area in which this game didn't improve upon the problems of its predecessor was cultural sensitivity. The first stage that I entered, Idle Springs, set off alarm bells immediately with its theming. There was an idol here who said "Ooga Ooga," and to defeat it, I had to get the locals to perform a rain dance. The people at Insomniac Games could have done literally anything, and they chose to do this. As long as I'm airing grievances, another thing that I don't like is the transitions into and out of levels. In Spyro 1, they were totally seamless, but in Ripto's Rage, they fade to black. I assume that there were technical reasons for this, but I wish that they had done something different with the loading screen instead of making a compromised version of what they had before. I got the Jade Idol Talisman for reaching the end of the stage, 1 orb for the rain dance thing, and another orb for feeding some fish to a giant head. The game hadn't really put its best foot forward with Idle Springs, but things got better from there. Back in the home area, I paid Moneybags 500 gems for the ability to dive by pressing the square button while swimming. Using this ability led me to an orb sitting out in the open, and then to my next stage, Sunny Beach. Here, I needed to move giant tortoises onto switches in order to open gates and escort a group of turtle children from the start of the stage to the end. Doing so earned me the Turtle Medallion Talisman. Also here was an orb task where I needed to use the Power Flame power-up to release turtles who were trapped in boxes. At one point, I had to stand on a switch to hold a door open and shoot through it. I liked how this part incorporated the main gimmick for the level into the side objective. From there, I went to Hurry Coasts. The main goal here was to create a path through the level by collecting diodes and using them to disable force fields. Doing so gave me the Gear of Power Talisman. The orbs here were kind of annoying to get. For the first one I had to put lightning stones into generators, but doing so would attract enemies who would undo my progress. There were only 10 of them and they didn't respawn, so I was able to complete my task once I had defeated all of them. The remaining 2 orbs came from an absurdly difficult platforming segment across a series of moving fans. I kind of wish that I had saved this one for later after I had gotten more comfortable using the hover. The next stage that I went to was Colossus, where I received a golden statue talisman for defeating a Yeti, a thing that I definitely did all on my own. I then got 2 orbs here for playing a hockey minigame. In the first round it was just Spyro versus a goalie. In the second round it was a full 2v2. I think that the first round was actually harder because I found the time limit to be a more difficult opponent than the enemy shooter. The most challenging part of the hockey game was just getting to the puck in a reasonable amount of time. The shooting was straightforward, just get the goalie to look one way and then shoot the other. After that, I went to Aquaria Towers. This is a classic type of video game location where you need to raise the water level to swim to places that you can't get to on foot. Raising the water levels in each section led me back to the start, where I was given the Enchanted Shell Talisman. I enjoyed this stage, but after swimming around it a couple of times without finding any orbs to collect, I moved on. At this point, I had gathered all of the talismans in Summer Forest, which meant that I could go to Crush's dungeon for the first boss fight of the game. Crush could shoot fireballs, which I needed to avoid by moving to the side, and he could also create shockwaves, which I needed to jump over. It was about as by the numbers as a 3D platformer boss can be, but that's more than I can say for any of the Spyro 1 bosses. It was a fun fight. So I'm not sure whether this was an effect of playing this game on a PlayStation 3, or if it's just because the used disc that I got was highly scratched, but I experienced audio issues during a few of the cutscenes. It was only ones that featured voice acting, and it usually just caused them to cut to silence, but other times it had more unusual effects.
Here in the Summer Forest. You're going to have to go to Avalar's worlds and convince the inhabitants to give you their talisman. You can keep them in your guidebook.
Torch Ripto! Torch Ripto!
Keep track of your running shoes. Keep track of your running shoes. Talisman. Talisman. If you come across any orbs,
I promise, that was not a YouTube poop, that was actually what my game sounded like. Other than cutscene voices, everything seemed to work normally, so I just enjoyed the weird messed up cutscenes while playing and looked up a video with the intended audio after. The second home world was called Autumn Plains. Similar to underwater swimming in the first world, Autumn Plains had its own new ability to learn. For 500 gems, Moneybags taught Spyro how to climb ladders. I had seen a number of ladders already, so I went back to investigate them. One in Summer Forest led to an orb. One in Glimmer led to Rue the Gem Cutter, who had an orb to offer for completing a Superfly challenge. And one in Sunny Beach led to the guy from Halo, who gave me an orb for playing a turtle herding minigame. When I played Spyro 1, I noted that there was only one point where I was given a reason to return to an earlier world. It was cool to see this game add more of that. The first Autumn Plains stage that I played was a prehistoric themed one named Skilo Spadlands. The rock spitting mechanic introduced earlier was used extensively here, and this was also the first place that I encountered the Invincible power-up. At the finish line, I got the Ancient Bone Talisman. I also earned 2 orbs for saving villagers from lizards that hatched from eggs. This was the second really difficult challenge in the game, and it was a lot more fun than the platforming one in Hurricos. I needed to memorize the order that the eggs hatched so that I could defeat the lizards as quickly as possible. But even after learning the route, it was still pretty hard because there was very little time to spare. From there, I went to Crystal Glacier, which was pleasantly colorful for a snowy area. There were frozen cave people here who I needed to thaw out in order to advance at various points, and doing so eventually led me to their leader, who possessed the Ice Crystal Talisman. There was a Superfly power-up here, which I used in order to defeat 10 spiders, thereby earning an orb, and then I got another orb for feeding fish to a snow leopard. The next stage was called Zephyr, and it was enormous. I needed to use cannons to blow things up in order to move through the level. For blowing up the tower that Corporal Glug was being held in, he gave me the Ruby Bomb Talisman. The professor was here and he gave Spyro a magic bean. I could plant the bean in various soft soil patches, with each location resulting in a differently shaped plant. Burning the plant would give me my bean back, allowing me to test each patch and find the proper order. This was a really fun puzzle. For completing it, I got 1 orb from the professor himself, and 1 orb from a soldier named Romeo, who I reunited with his companion, Juliet. Also here was a shepherd named Bo Peep, who had lost their cowlicks. I got an orb for herding 5 of them back to their pen. There were 2 other cowlicks remaining who were in the magic bean area, but I couldn't figure out how to get them to where they needed to go, so I never got Bo Peep's second orb. I then moved on to Breeze Harbor. I could stoke boilers using Spyro's flames in order to activate steam engines, but first I needed to defeat nearby enemies or they would spit water to extinguish them. For launching an airship at the end, I got the Glass Anchor Talisman. There were more cannons here, and I got an orb for using them to destroy 8 mines. The other orb here came from a minecart minigame. The trolley moved automatically, but I could jump, change lanes, and shoot cannonballs. This is a video game that is full of stuff, both for better and for worse. But surprisingly often it was for the better. There was some real effort put into a lot of these minigames. Next up was a stage simply titled Scorch, and I'm still not really sure what was going on there. There were these innocent-seeming blonde kids who were at this Disney's Aladdin-looking palace, and apparently they were on a mission to bomb it? I can't tell if this game understands how loaded this is, or who the butt of the joke is supposed to be, but I would like the game a lot better if it didn't have this kind of humor in it. I got 1 orb from Hunter for knocking some monkeys out of trees, another from one of the kids for chasing some people on flying carpets, and then the other kid gave me the Emerald Scarab Talisman. After that, I went to Fracture Hills, which had some of my favorite NPCs in the game, these cute fawns playing with yo-yos. There were also these satyrs who were trapped in stone, and each one who I freed would play a bagpipe song that destroyed part of the mountain in the middle of the stage. Eventually, the temple underneath was excavated, and I was able to get the bronze flute talisman from the fawn inside. There was another fawn who was trapped behind a door, and I had to do a long and difficult supercharge course to rescue her, but I was rewarded with an orb for doing so. Hunter was also here, and he needed help too. I needed to bring an alchemist to free him, but there were indestructible enemies called Earthshapers in the way. I needed to distract the Earthshaper nearest to the alchemist to keep him from being crushed, but the route that he took was deliberately misleading, so it was difficult to guess which Earthshaper I needed to go to next. I got an orb for doing that, and then traveled to the next level, Magma Cone, which I kept wanting to read as Magma Core. For reaching the top of the volcano and closing its lid, I got the Volcano Idol Talisman. There was a Superfly task here, where I had to pick up rocks while flying and spit them at enemies. Hitting the enemies wasn't that hard, but picking up the rocks themselves was actually fairly precise. After a couple of attempts, I saw the game over screen for the first and only time. Most ways in which you can fail don't cost lives, so declaring this specifically a game over when there were other things that I struggled at for longer felt kind of arbitrary. I didn't feel like trying that challenge again, so I moved on to Shady Oasis. There was a character here named Shorty the Hippo, and whenever I fed them berries, they would get bigger and open a path to the next area. Once we reached the end, they gave me the Mystic Lamp Talisman. There was another hippo there who offered me an orb for catching 3 thieves. Oh no, the thieves from the first game were back and they had a new, but no less dubious design. I got all 3 of them and then moved on. I now had all of the talisman from Autumn Plains, and so I was able to go to Gulp's Overlook. During this boss fight, pterodactyls dropped weapons for Spyro to use. Each weapon had to be used differently, charging into barrels, lighting the fuses of bombs with fire breath, and spitting out rockets. Weapons that I didn't use could be used by Gulp against me. It was another fun but pretty basic boss. So, Spyro the Dragon had included a demo for the game Crash Bandicoot Warped, but I didn't play it because there's a very small chance that I might want to cover those games in this series at some point. But Ripto's Rage included a demo for Crash Team Racing, and I did decide that it would be safe to play that one. The demo's title screen was very bare bones, clearly not meant to be indicative of the final game. There was no music, and the only menu options were the number of players. After selecting the number of players, it loaded straight into the race. There was no character select, so I was locked into playing as Crash. The controls were easy to guess: X to accelerate, circle to use items, and R1 to jump and drift. The gameplay was obviously pretty derivative of Mario Kart 64, but it was a good imitation, better than I expected. It was pretty fun, even though I finished 6th place out of 8. After completing the 1P race, I tried out the 2P race, which was an entirely different track, but a more boring one. This one was flatter and had fewer sharp turns. I had warmed up by this point and got first place very easily. The 4P race was yet another track, but there were no CPUs this time, so I just did the laps by myself. Overall, I'd say that it was an effective demo. The character designs and the aesthetics of the tracks did not seem super appealing to me, but it felt good to play. Seems like it would be a fun multiplayer game. The third homeworld was called Winter Tundra. For 1,000 gems, Moneybags taught Spyro a move called Head Bash. I could now press triangle while in the air to pound the ground. By using this to smash rocks nearby, I found an orb. I returned to Fracture Hills where I had escorted the alchemist earlier, and Hunter gave me an orb for using Head Bash to help him fight the Earthshapers. I also returned to Shady Oasis where I got an orb for using Head Bash to free 8 hippos trapped in stone before an invincible power-up ran out. I then went back to Winter Tundra and entered the Mystic Marsh. This was a huge open level. At the end of it, I got an orb where I normally would have gotten a talisman. It turned out that none of the stages in this world had talismans, so all that I needed to do to reach the boss was collect orbs. A character named Basil the Explorer gave me an orb for catching 4 thieves. I was pleasantly surprised that these thieves turned out to be funny animals. Having them be flying squirrels so that they could glide the same way that Spyro could was a good idea. I then went on to Cloud Temples. Again, there was an orb just for reaching the end. There was also one for stealthily following around a hapless spy named Agent Zero. Cloud Temples was the one place in the game to use the Super Freeze power-up, but it used it very effectively. There was a task where I needed to ring the bells in the tops of 3 bell towers, and I needed to freeze trolls with proper timing in order to build staircases to get up to them. It was a fun little gimmick, and it rewarded me with another orb. Next was Robotica Farms, which was a short and largely unmemorable stage. I got 1 orb from Farmer Appleby for burning 4 bugs that would run away from me, but unlike thieves who were able to change direction, the bugs always went clockwise, making them easy to cut off. Then I got an orb from Farmer John for getting to the end of the stage. The last stage before the boss was called Metropolis. I really liked the theming here, but it was another pretty quick and easy one. Generally, I think that the brevity of Spyro levels is a good thing, but this was one that I wouldn't have minded seeing fleshed out some more. I got an orb from playing a minigame where an ox was throwing bombs at me while I skated on some ice. It's interesting that they used a fixed camera angle for this, but not for the hockey minigame. I feel like it would have been nice to have had it there too. The next 3 orbs all came from a character named Inventor Droid. I love her design. She gave me the first orb simply for reaching her. I earned the remaining 2 from shooting down sheep saucers using a combination power-up. I found all-range mode much easier to handle in this than it was in Star Fox 64, and so I completed this task fairly quickly. The second round ended in a double knockout, but very generously the game counted it in my favor. At this point, I had everything that I needed for the final confrontation with Ripto, but before we talk about that, we need to talk about boxes. Let's begin here with the version of Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage that I have. The first thing that struck me about the North American box was that it's very similar conceptually and compositionally to the Spyro the Dragon box. At the very least, I think that they could have mirrored it and had the logo in the top right so that the 2 boxes didn't look so similar. The pose is better on the Spyro 2 box, as is the contrast, but I like the colors on the Spyro 1 box more. So, my copy is the greatest hits version, but apparently the original printing of the game used a foil treatment for the flames in the background. It's not really something that shows up in images, though. In PAL regions, this game was called Spyro 2 Gateway to Glimmer. I like that title a lot better, and I think I prefer this logo design too, but I don't really care much for the rest of the box. The motion blur effect on Spyro's tail, wings, and legs looks really ugly to me. Finally, here's Japan's cover. Like with Spyro 1, the Japanese cover absolutely crushes the others in terms of color palette and character cuteness. I especially really like how Zoe looks here. Unfortunately, this one also has some motion blur going on, this time to differentiate the foreground and background, and I don't like it here much more than I liked it on the PAL box. I don't care for the lens flare either. Something that you might notice here is that the title is Spyro X Sparks Tone Demo Tours. It's very fun to include Sparks in the title. It's weird to me how rarely acknowledged he is given that he's present with Spyro throughout the entire journey. Also, I haven't mentioned this previously because I'm pretty sure it's a well-known anecdote, but Ripto's name evidently came from someone looking at Spyro's name in the Japanese logo and interpreting the katakana as Latin characters. For the first time in this series, I'm not really a fan of any of these boxes. I think that Spyro 2 deserved better. The end of the game kind of snuck up on me. The worlds had been named Summer Forest, Autumn Plains, and Winter Tundra, which seemed to imply the existence of a fourth, spring-themed world. Also, just before I entered Ripto's arena, Elora had some dialogue which I thought was implying that this wasn't actually the final battle. I figured out that I was wrong around the time that the second phase started, and it became clear that this was the dramatic finale. The battle started with a duel between Spyro and Ripto. Hunter flew around above, dropping green, red, and blue orbs into the arena. These could be collected by either combatant. Every 3 orbs that I got would give Spyro a power-up based on the color of the last orb that I collected. Similarly, every 3rd orb for Ripto would cause him to do an attack based on that orb's color. Once the battle had raged on long enough, Hunter started throwing out sheep in addition to orbs, allowing me to replenish Spyro's health. Ripto, however, had no way of healing, and once his health was empty, we went to the second phase, in which he mounted a robot version of Gulp, the World 2 boss. It was essentially the same as the first phase, only Ripto's attacks were different. My health got dangerously low at a couple of points, but I played it safe and focused on getting sheep whenever they were available. The third phase was an air battle similar to the one against the flying saucers that I had just done in Metropolis. I liked the contrasting visuals of the bright orange lava below and the dark indigo sky above. This phase was the easiest of the 3, and so I ended up beating the boss in one go. After the credits, I gained access to a new location called Dragon Shores, but I couldn't go any further than the entrance. There was a bouncer who told me that I needed to gather 55 orbs and 8,000 gems before I would be allowed to enter. At this point, I had 43 orbs and 5,600 gems. I could have stopped there. I had, by most reasonable definitions, completed the game already. However, since I had been anticipating a 4th world anyway, I decided why not get those extra collectibles and see what's behind the door. The first thing that I did was get the remaining orbs that I had missed in the 3 homeworlds. There were 2 remaining in Winter Tundra, 2 in Autumn Plains, and 1 in Summer Forest. After that, I went looking for stages worth revisiting. I had managed to miss all 3 orbs in Aquaria Towers, so I started there. It turned out that I had overlooked a hole in the ceiling leading to an underwater city area up above. It was a really cool moment suddenly being in the open ocean after only conceiving of this level as a series of tunnels up until that point. Hunter gave me 2 orbs for completing a minigame where I rode around on a ray flying through rings. After collecting the Manta Ray's reward, King Flippy sent me on a quest to rescue seahorses from the tops of each of the 6 towers in the level. I loved how this mission required navigating both this new upper area of the stage and also the lower sections. I already really liked Aquaria Towers the first time I came here, but this revisit really cemented it as my favorite level in the game. It's so good. Next, I got an orb from the professor back in Colossus for finding 10 statues, and then I went to Magma Cone and got an orb for beating Hunter in a minigame where I had to catch crystals as they shot up out of geysers. There was a more difficult version of this task that I could have done for a second orb, but I decided that it was too hard and just left. That made 2 Magma Cone orbs that I had given up on. I think it must be the hardest stage in the game. I'm curious whether this is a common opinion. After that, I did a pretty fun supercharge task in Robotica Farms, and then I returned to Skelos Badlands to collect 10 bones. I'm glad that this ended up being the last orb that I needed because it meant that I got to enjoy watching this as my celebration. I had my 55 orbs, but I was still short by about 1,300 gems. Something that might not be obvious is that gems never respawn once collected, so there's no way to grind for them. If I wanted more gems, I needed to find ones that I had neglected. And the part of the game that I had neglected the most was the flight stages. Oh yeah, this game has flight stages like the ones in Spyro 1. In that game they were a fun diversion from the normal platforming levels. The inclusion of them here in Spyro 2 was much weirder, mainly because the gameplay here was so varied that there was no need for diversions, but also because flying had already been incorporated into the game by way of power-ups. I played all 3 of Ocean Speedway, Metro Speedway, and Canyon Speedway, and got over 1,000 gems for doing so. Then something surprising happened. While playing the Third World's flight stage, I noticed Hunter out of the corner of my eye. I talked to him and found out that there was a secret rail shooter minigame hidden there. It was pretty fun, and a nice surprise. At last, I finally had all of the orbs and gems that I needed to enter Dragon Shores. You know, they could have named it Dragon Springs instead, and completed the season-based naming pattern while still sounding like a vacation destination. Anyway, there were no orbs or talismans to collect here. Instead, there were a total of 10 tokens, which could be won by playing various carnival games. There was a dunking booth and Tunnel of Love, neither of which posed any challenge. Then there was a shooting gallery, which was only slightly more robust. It seemed disappointingly low effort compared to the secret shooting game that I had just played in Canyon Speedway. The only real attraction here was the roller coaster. This was essentially a new course for the trolley minigame from Breeze Harbor. The trolley had been one of my favorite orbs to get, so I was happy to get to play it again here. This game had so many one-offs that it was nice to see one of the better ones get revisited. The goal was to pop all of the balloons in each of 3 rounds. In the first round, all I needed to do was jump. In the second round, lane changing was introduced, and in the third round, shooting was added. This was peculiar because the earlier trolley minigame threw all of these mechanics at me at once. It almost feels like you're meant to encounter this version first, but that would be nearly impossible given the requirements to get here. Hey, why doesn't Spyro let Sparks ride in the coaster with him? I can never tell what the relationship between these two is supposed to be. The only reward for collecting all of the tokens was a cutscene viewer. It was an underwhelming end to the game, but the journey itself was good. Completing Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage took me 9 hours and 50 minutes. When I factor in the time that I spent playing the game after defeating Ripto, my total time was 13 hours and 52 minutes. My final completion percentage, according to the in-game tracker, was 88%. So, you might be here watching this video because you're nostalgic for this game. I can't really blame you. When I look at the state of modern video games, I too miss the salad days. But something that I want to do with this series is demonstrate that old games have so much more to offer than just nostalgia. They're good today for all of the same reasons that they were good back then. I had never played or even seen someone else play either of these Spyro games until I started this project, but I've truly enjoyed both of them. If you're someone who only cares about the games that were part of your own childhood, I hope that I can encourage you to branch out. You really can play a game almost 30 years late and still love it. Thank you so much for watching, I do really appreciate it. If you enjoyed hearing about my experience with this game, it would mean a lot to me if you'd press the like button. I spent a lot of this video comparing Spyro the Dragon and Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage. These games share a lot in common, but I feel like they play different roles. Spyro the Dragon is such a breezy game. If I was having a bad day, I could sit down and play through it from start to finish in one sitting without it ever raising my heart rate. It's important to have games like that. The pacing of Ripto's Rage, however, is much slower, and its difficulty is all over the place. Its strength lies more in its breadth of content. It's a game that would be fun to chip away at over the course of a couple of weeks, maybe passing the controller back and forth with a friend. Ultimately, I'm going to give Ripto's Rage the advantage because I liked the boss fights a lot more. But that's as far as it goes. My World My Way in many ways felt like a game made just for me. But I would never say that about the Spyro games because I find their sense of humor so off-putting. And with that, Ripto's Rage is my new number 2. For my next video, I'll be playing a licensed game for the first time in this series. It'll also be the most recent game that I've played so far. Don't worry, it's not that recent. It's a game for the PlayStation Portable. I'll see you back here in a few weeks.
If you come across any orbs,